David, what is a podcast that isn't this one that you like?
I like Hidden Minds, that NPR podcast.
Oh, okay, good. Well, maybe we should go on them. If you're
Yeah, that would
listening,
be
anybody, that'd be great. Yeah.
yeah.
We can give them a bump.
hmm
Anyway, uh, that's funny. On that note, what are we listening to in this podcast?
Well, we're not listening to it, but you, the listener, are, and you are listening to actual evolutionary psychology by actual evolutionary psychologists. And the name of the podcast is
Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast. It was the royal we, by the way. But
the Right. Yeah, okay. Well,
yeah.
I often mix up the royal we with
No,
the
it's like
literal
it
we.
doesn't translate over the acoustic modality. Well, actually, it doesn't. Yeah, there's really no. Is there a text way to sort of, I guess, scare quotes?
Scare
This is
quotes.
why we're not as popular as the Hidden Brain podcast.
We,
We
we,
have
we've, we've,
nonsense introductions like this.
well, hopefully we haven't scared you away with our scare quotes or lack thereof.
Yeah,
Keep listening.
but we do have parentheses.
Yes.
They're like they're like they're like
Parentheses are I prefer
they're
the
like
parentheses.
gateway drug to scare quotes.
They really are.
It's like the marijuana to the cocaine of
I
scare
love
quotes.
parentheses. I have a habit of
Oh, I do
overusing
too. Oh,
parentheticals in my
people
writing.
just tell
I
me. I
can't
do too. Yeah.
I
It
can't
started
get
for me
enough.
as a young age. I just thought
Yeah,
parenthetical
you
asides
just
are
got hooked.
hilarious. It's the comedian in you. It's the bad writer in me and the comedian in you. So,
It's true. Parentheticals are great for highlighting contradictions and double standards.
mm,
I made great use of them in my alliance theory paper.
ah,
They came in very handy there.
fantastic.
Yeah.
So if you love parentheses, stay tuned
Yep.
or hate them. David, today we have a fantastic guest.
Her name is Brooke Scelza. She's a professor at UCLA. She studies a group of pastoralists in Namibia known as the Himba. And she just absolutely does fascinating work studying an interesting culture that will be different from our vantage point. And I think her research really complicates and adds nuance to the evolutionary psychology of mating and jealousy and parental investment.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And I love that we also get into discussion from there about sort of like what's the landscape of the evolutionary social sciences and how are we doing and are psychologists and anthropologists talking to each other enough? And we even talk about what else do we talk about, David?
Well, we talked about the manosphere
Oh,
briefly and
right.
how
Yeah.
evolutionary social science can sometimes be perverted. We talked about the perverse incentive structures of academia, the
That's what
replication
it was.
crisis.
Yes, that's right. The replication. Yeah, that was I feel like that was a real moment there. I think that's a highlight of this episode.
Yeah, for sure. It was a really fun, wide-ranging conversation. I think you'll have a great time listening to it.
Enjoy. Okay, we're recording. Today we have Brooke Scelza, who is a biological anthropologist in the Department of Anthropology at UCLA. It's a fantastic department with lots of very wonderful evolutionary social scientists. Brooke, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me on.
You study a really interesting population that has very interesting attributes. And I was reading up on them, and we'll talk about it in a second. But I also immediately upon reading upon about it, I also imagine that like one worries about essentializing a whole category of people or a whole group of people. And so I'll just say now that the group of people that you study has noted for the degree to which there's promiscuity or paternity uncertainty, and we'll get into that jargon later. But I also imagine that, like, if I were you, and maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong, like, I'd be a little bit tired about just having the whole community and the whole world there that you know so well being distilled down to that weird point. So can you just sort of start off by saying like what it is that you study, and we can sort of go, over the different topics. And we just had Karen Kramer on talking about cooperative breeding, and I think people are really interested in issues, especially in modern circumstances, especially with changes in the mating market of like, cuckoldry and especially like the incel movement and those kinds of things, right? The manosphere, where there's sort of men who feel downtrodden or left out. And yeah, and I will shut up in a second and ask a question. But basically, I think, as I understand it, a lot of your work sort of is relevant to all of that in this context of a society that has sort of a unique area on the distribution of mating situations. So, can you tell us a little bit about who you study and what's unique about them? But then also in the context of, have we sort of essentialized them too much, or what can they tell us? Yeah.
Sure. So I actually went there to study cooperative breeding. Um,
Mm,
my dissertation, which was in Australia, was looking at the roles of grandmothers and things like that. And so I originally went there wanting to interview women about the sort of transition to motherhood. And so that was, I didn't actually go in to study anything about mating at all, really. Um,
mm,
and it wasn't until I started talking to people that these topics came up. And they started talking to me about this in the context of collecting their reproductive histories. And then I realized, like, oh, they keep bringing this up. Maybe this is something I should ask about. So I kind of followed the question found me, I guess.
mm,
Um, but yes, I would say that at this point, the majority of the work that I have done with them has looked at the kind of pattern of what I call concurrency, right? Which is the idea that you have both a formal marital partner and then informal partners as well. And both men and women have multiple partners, and it's quite common. As far as sort of essentializing them, I mean, I think one of the things that I was hoping would come out of this work was the idea that there's a spectrum, right? And they may fall on one end of the spectrum in terms of how prominent these extramarital relationships are. But the idea was to expose the spectrum because I think so much of what we do is on the very other end of the spectrum where extra pair paternity is at, something like 1%. And that's where all of our work and all of our theorizing and our ideas about, like, what's universal and what's not all kind of come
mm,
from this very thin slice. And so it took my sort of working with a population who was maybe at the other end of the spectrum to actually highlight the fact that there was a spectrum. So I think in that sense, I'm trying not to essentialize them. And then, obviously, all populations are in flux. And so I can see changes in their norms and behaviors about this stuff just in the 15 years that I've been working there, right? As they become more market integrated and things like that. So I can
mm.
talk more specifically about that, but.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about how their norms and behaviors have changed over the past 15 years and what you think might be behind those changes.
Yeah, so there's when I first started working there, it was 2010. There was pretty much no use of contraception. They were the vast majority of their diet was still quite subsistence based. So they are pastoralist, so it's a lot of sour milk and meat. And they have gardens where they're growing maize and things like that. But they had a very long-term drought that started a few years after I started working there. It lasted almost 10 years. And that brought more of an influx of things like store-bought maize into the communities and things like that. And then other things also were just changing with the times, right? So like even though there's no electricity out there, they all have little mini solar panels to charge their cell phones, right? So basically everyone has a cell phone, but no one has indoor plumbing or running water or anything like that. So as they get more market integrated, and their ideas about inheritance and things like that are gonna shift. So to put my anthropologist hat on for a minute, they have something called double descent is the inheritance practice that they have. So that means that everybody has membership with both their maternal clan and their paternal clan, and those are both important in different ways. But the wealth comes down matrilaterally. So instead of going father to son, the majority of the cows go mother's brother to sister's son. So they pass through the mother's side of the family. And typically, when you have that happen, it opens up more possibilities to be able to have higher paternity uncertainty, because if you don't have to worry about whether your son is your son, right? But you're giving it to your sister's son, there's it's a little bit more of a safe bet, basically, that you're giving your wealth to somebody that you are indeed biologically related to. So you tend to see more paternity uncertainty in cultures that have matrilineal or matrilateral inheritance.
Uh, that's really interesting, just because it suggests it's obvious, but I want to say it out loud that it's not just that the psychology is sort of obviously it's concerned about paternity uncertainty, but I think there's this idea that sort of like it either exists or it doesn't. And if it doesn't exist, it's horrible. And there's just sort of like a mushroom cloud coming out of somebody's head, as
Yeah,
opposed to sort of there's just facultative responses to that, right? Where
right.
it's not only whether or not there's paternity uncertainty, there's also the issue of like, well, what's the transmission of wealth or status? And we've talked about how reproduction is not just about sex, it's about inheritance and it's about investing. And I think the psychology of that and is really important. And it sounds like what you're saying is intrinsic to sort of how people get by with or tolerate or embrace different kinds of reproductive strategies is not just about the sex, but it's intimately tied to resource flows, especially intergenerational resource flows.
Yep. And so what you're seeing now is that with more market integration, the more cash becomes the currency instead of cows, right? So when cows were the currency, everybody knew the rules, right? You had to give
Mm,
these cows from uncle to nephew, or and as you get cash, though, the rules become more flexible, right? Like, well, if I sell these cows and I have the cash in hand, can I give that cash now to my own kids? And so we've asked people about sort of in an ideal world, especially young people, what would you prefer? Would you prefer to have this uncle to nephew system or the father to son system? And a lot of the younger people were saying, no, I'd prefer to go father to son. And one way to get around that is sell your cows and give the cash to your kids, right? So the more they switch to the cash economy, the more ability there is to kind of break with some of those norms. But then along with that, what you also see is that people are going to start caring more about paternity certainty, because if they're giving their wealth now father to son, then they may care more that those sons are biologically their sons.
mm,
So which then is going to start to constrain women's autonomy and other things. So normally I think we think about things like globalization as being good for women's autonomy. This may be a situation where over the next 10 or 20 years, you start to see a lot more restrictions on women's autonomy as they become sort of more market integrated. So it's these things, like you said, are really sort of situational and context dependent.
mm,
Hmm. It's a really beautiful example of how the relationship between resource flows and mating systems is a bidirectional causal relationship. That on the one hand, that if the resource flows through mothers, such that uncles are investing in their nephews rather than their own direct children, then that allows women to engage in more extramarital relationships, because husbands don't or their husbands don't have to worry about whether their kids are their own, because they're not investing in those kids so much as their sister's kids. But on the other hand, the resource flow also, affects the mating system. Or did I get that backwards? The mating system affects the resource flow. So if we're in a position where I want to be investing in my direct kids, such that I have cash in my pocket and I want to make sure it goes to my children as opposed to my nephews, then all of a sudden I need to create paternity certainty, and that affects the mating system. I think it's a really interesting example of just how complex and mind-bending these things can become. But I'm curious. So, like, I want to get into the details of how this works. So, right now, the men are primarily investing in their sister's kids. Is that right?
Not exactly. So
Not exactly. Okay.
this is the part that I think complicates it even more, is
Okay.
that one of the really interesting things that we found that to me was almost more mind-blowing than the high rate of extra-pair paternity itself, is how much the men really are still investing in their kids, whether or not they are biologically their kids, right? So I think our expectation is that in a system like this where there's high extra-pair paternity, that the men wouldn't be investing very much, right?
Hmm.
And yet what we see is side by side a high rate of extra-pair paternity and pretty high norms of paternal investment. So we've asked men, we did these vignettes with them where we gave them situations where the men in the story bias their investment toward their biological child against the child, their sort of social child who wasn't biologically theirs. And the norms are really, really strong that's a bad thing to do, that you should be treating those kids equally. And then
Mm.
we mapped the answers to those vignettes onto actual investment patterns. So we developed vignettes that mapped onto forms of investment that we had actual behavioral data on. And the norms are stronger than the behavior, right? Which is often the case. But even the behavior was still quite strong, particularly with things like bride price, right? So something where it's like a very public form of paternal investment, the men really didn't want to shirk their duties towards their kids. So they have really strong norms that you should treat your kids equally. And it's not because they're being tricked, right? So you might think, oh,
Mm.
well, maybe that's just because they don't know which kids are theirs and which kids are not theirs. And so they have to sort of take the risk. That's not the case. They're actually very good. And we know this from the genetics now at knowing which kids are theirs and not theirs biologically. And there's sort of a fun story of
Right.
how we figured that out. But they have these really strong norms about social fatherhood, and there's a lot of reputation sort of tied up in being a good father and treating those kids equally.
Interesting. So, there is a social norm that the men should treat their wives' children equally, regardless of whether those children are their biological children or not, or whether someone else has fathered them. Um, it's extremely interesting. So I want to get into the fun story of how you found out that men actually know which kids are their own, because it seems like a pretty tough thing to figure out if you don't know the timing of intercourse and how it related to offspring. And sometimes kids resemble their parents, but sometimes it can be kind of ambiguous. So how are they figuring this out, and what's the fun story behind how you figured out what they're figuring out?
So there's a couple different mechanisms that they're using. One is physical resemblance, and they talk about the idea that once the kid gets to sort of walking around age, that's when they really can start to get a good look at them and start to use resemblance. But they also are using both gossip and direct communication with their spouses. So often
Mm,
people know that their partners have other partners, and they will sometimes talk directly to their wives, and their wives will just say, like, yeah, this one's from the boyfriend. Not all couples will do that. That sort of varies depending on the sort of communication in a particular couple. They also
mm,
have long periods of spousal separation. So the men go off to a cattle post and they'll be gone for several months, right? So
Mm.
in terms of coital frequency and things like that, when they come back, they'll know they were gone for 4 months and they come back and their wife is pregnant. That's, pretty good sign. So they've got sort of a suite of different ways of doing this. But even so, right, we didn't know how accurate they would be. So one of the things that when we did this paternity study, we developed the methods with the community, right? Because this, as you can imagine, is a difficult thing to do. And so we developed this whole double blind method where we, the anthropologists, wouldn't know more than they would about the results. So we have a whole complicated system to do that. But we went back before we published to present the results. And so we presented to them, if a man has 10 kids, around five of them, it turns out, are going to be kids where he's not the biological father. And they were like, yeah, yeah, we've been telling you this for 10 years. Like,
mm.
this is not
So he
news.
has so any of the kids that his wife has, he has about a 50% chance of them being his kids. Interesting. What's interesting
They're
about
about,
that is
yeah,
that it's mathematic. If you're thinking in Darwinian terms, it's mathematically equivalent to invest in those kids versus investing in his sister's kids, because there his kids are 25% genetic overlap with him, and with the wife, if half of the kids are his and half aren't, 50 divided by 2 is 25. So in terms of the math, in Darwinian terms, investing in either woman's kids is about the same, which is really interesting.
yes, except if you go up generation, right, assuming that this is happening across generations, then your sister, there's a likelihood that your sister is not actually your full sister.
Mm,
Ah, okay, interesting.
mm.
So it does get a little bit more complicated than that.
But assuming it's your full sister, then
Assuming it's your full sister, then yes.
yeah,
And it's 48%, so it's a little bit less, right? But
right.
so then we said to them, so the other thing we found was that both men and women, so we had their assertions. So when I first started doing this, I was just asking people, do you think these kids are yours or not yours, right? So the women had started telling me on their own when I was doing their reproductive histories. And then I started, when I interviewed the men the following summer, they would list their wives and their kids, and they have polygyny, right? So there'd be often a long list of kids, and they would just go through and say, mine, not mine, 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 not mine, mine. So we had all those assertions that what we could then map onto the genetic paternity results, and neither the community nor us know the specific individual results. So a statistician who's never been to the field and doesn't know them got that information, but we knew the aggregate. So we knew that both men and women were right about 70 to 75% of the time. So when I presented that back to them, I said, here's the extra pair paternity result for the community. And then about 7 out of 10 times people are correct in knowing whether the child is theirs or not theirs. And their response to that was, oh no, we're better than that. And and I said, oh, what makes you think so? Right? And they said, well, because when we're talking to you, the men are going, both men and women for different reasons, I think, are gonna tell you that a child is the husband's, even if they're pretty sure that it's not, because we want you to understand those men think of those kids as theirs, right?
Mm,
So basically, they're telling me that there's going to be a reporting bias, right?
mm,
Mhm.
And especially because some of those assertions we got pretty far back. It was maybe like 5 years previous by the time we were telling them about the paternity results because we did that earlier on. So I didn't know people as well, things like that. So I wanted to take that seriously, right? If somebody tells you that people are giving you, skewed data, you want to actually look at that, right? So we went back and we looked at the cases where they were wrong, and I'm using air quotes here. And what we found was that 90% of the time that they were wrong in that direction, right? Where they
mm.
were saying the kid was theirs,
Yeah,
but it wasn't theirs. So given
yeah.
that, we figured that actually that 70-75% accuracy is probably a floor level of accuracy, and they really do know quite well. So I
Mm,
think they're combining all these different methods. A lot of times these are paternity results, not on kids, but on adults, right? Because we're taking these data across generations. So they've had a lot of time to sort of figure this out, and they seem to be pretty good at it. So they're not being trick. I mean, there may be individual cases where they would be surprised by the result, but on the whole, they're not being tricked.
yeah.
Hmm.
It's really interesting. I mean, from a very simple evolutionary perspective, the idea that people are good at detecting paternity would would concomitantly then suggest that that would go along with sort of design for investment, right? If you didn't invest, if you were a, I don't know, a shark or something, and you just, made it and then you like swam away, you don't worry about paternity because you're not investing. So I think the idea of like parental and especially male parental investment, the idea of that would sort of be consistent with this idea that you're in your data, you're getting evidence of people being quite good at detecting paternity uncertainty. Or that's
Except,
not the right term, but like, yeah, but assessing paternity uncertainty.
except I think given that they are so good, it's surprising that they have these norms to treat them equally, right? So they
Yes.
have
Mm,
these
Yes.
norms
yes.
set up that are saying, yeah, we know you can,
Right.
people are figuring this out.
Yeah.
Despite that, we have set up this strong norm structure that you should treat those kids
Yeah.
equally.
And then
And
what do you think is, so I mean, that's and it sounds like because of market integration, it's kind of eroding a little bit,
a
because the
little
fungibility of money, but what do you attribute how do you get a stable dynamic where that norm is there? I'm sure you've thought about a lot about that. Yeah.
Well, in I think part of the reason they got to that place was because of this spousal separation, right? So you have other pastoralists, right? Like this isn't just like a thing about pastoralists or something, for example, right?
Mm.
But they lots of pastoralists have long periods of spousal separation, right? It's sort of somewhat built into sort of to herding, especially in drought-prone environments, right? And yet other pastoralists have very, very strict norms about paternity. Um, and but you sort of have two choices, right? One is that you can say, we're going to relax these norms and sort of not do a lot of mate guarding. The other is to sort of double down on mate guarding. I
Mm.
think it's sort of there's sort of a package of things that were going on. You've got the historical cultural inertia of matrilineal. You've got the spousal separation making the cost of mate guarding higher. You've got high value to those kids. So the kids are working really hard, right? So I just listened to your episode with Karen Kramer, right? And she was talking about how much work kids do, right? So similar
Mm.
in pastoral societies, the kids are working hard from a young age. They're value added to the household, right? And so in that sense, that sort of lowers the cost of those kids, right? And so you've got sort of this whole kind of suite of different things that sort of create a perfect storm that allows these norms to come into place. And then for each individual man, he's not just losing paternity on some of the kids of his wives, he's gaining because it's not
Mm.
just the wives or
Right.
the boyfriends,
Right.
right? They
Yeah.
also have all these girlfriends. So they are gaining paternity outside of marriage. And so I think there's sort of a balancing out that happens
Mm.
where, and again, we haven't looked at this with the genetics, but when I've looked at sort of across age cohorts, what you see is that men don't get married until their late 20s. They don't really start sort of building marital families until sort of later. And so they're getting a lot of they're gaining a lot of paternity early on, right? In their
Mm.
late teens, their 20s, before they can marry, before they've acquired a bunch of resources. They're
Mm.
sort of sneaking paternity. And
Right.
then as they get older, they are probably losing more paternity. But if you look at the oldest cohort, it sort of is balanced out how much they think they've lost versus how much they've gained from
Mm.
their own extramarital relationships. So
Mm.
it kind of is keeps everybody happy in a way too, right? Because it's like if the old men were bogarting all of the paternity, you got a lot
Right.
of unhappy men, especially when you have polygyny, right? And this
Right.
is the way to ensure in a way that those young men are still getting access, they're still fathering kids, but they're just not doing it through the sort of traditional marital pathway when they're young.
That's
Right.
fascinating. Do the men invest at all in their girlfriends' kids, or what's the relationship there?
Yeah, good question. Yes. And so kids often know who their biological father is, right? And certainly the social father is primary, right? So that husband-wife relationship is still quite strong, but
Mm.
kids will often know. And so, for example, if a child is sick, the mother or somebody from the mother's family might send somebody to the boyfriend's compound. There's no obligation, but there's sort of a norm that you would do something. So they might just come to the compound and say, "This child is sick," right? And then it's up to them to decide whether they want to, contribute a goat or something that they can sell to get money. But often they will. So there's those kinds of like specific responses to emergencies, but also boyfriends give stuff to girlfriends. So we've tracked all those transfers. Cash is a really good thing to give a girlfriend because it's easy to sort of slip away versus a goat or something that you're bringing home and then then there's sort of you're sort of breaking the code of silence in a way, right? Because
Creating
like
common knowledge of the transfer.
yeah,
Yeah.
Right.
if you come home with this goat and you say like, so sometimes they'll have workarounds. So they might,
I
she
found a
might
goat.
Just wandered in here. I don't know where it came from.
I don't know where but the boyfriend will drop a goat off at the girl's uncle's compound, and then she'll
Um,
go to her uncle's compound and get that goat, and then she'll come home and
nice.
the husband will say, "Where'd you get that goat?" And she'll say, "Oh, from my uncle's compound." Right?
Oh,
It
okay.
was coming
Mm.
from the boyfriend. So,
It's
Brilliant.
so it's so like recognizable, right? I love this about anthropology or humans is just or any species really when it comes to this stuff. If you look past the superficial variation, it's all very recognizable. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So would you say that the norm that exists with the husband's wife's kids, where he has to treat the kids equally, is absent from the girlfriend's kids, such that, when it's his wife's kids, he should treat the kids equally, but if it's his girlfriend's kids, it's okay for him to preferentially invest in his biological kids and not the other woman's kids. Is that how it works?
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm trying to think if I guess we haven't. Yeah, we've looked a little bit at that. Oh, yeah, yeah, we have looked at that. So we had another one of these sort of vignette games because we these work really well because they often have sort of like picture cards and things like that. So we
Mhm.
did another sort of vignette experiment where we had cards where we looked at three different sort of things. So we had wife with your child, wife not your child, girlfriend your child, and then ex-wife, your child, ex-wife, not your child, right? So we
Mhm.
varied the paternity, we varied the type of relationship, and then we had them allocate like little different kinds of things across those six categories. And they definitely favored paternity, right? In all the cases, but less so when it was a formal partner, right? So you're supposed to treat
Mhm.
your wife's kids equally more than your girlfriend's kids. Um,
Mhm.
and in part, what they said was that's because the girlfriend typically, has a husband who's going to care for those kids, right? So his sort of
Mhm.
formalized responsibility, especially to kids that aren't biologically his, is going to be weaker, right? And what the women say is when you're choosing a husband, wealth really matters, right? Because if you're his wife, he's obligated to give you X percentage of his cows to milk every day or whatever. If you have a boyfriend, yeah, wealth is important, but generosity is really what's important because it's
Mm.
up to him to decide whether he's going to, how much he's going to give you. And so you could have a really wealthy boyfriend, but if he's stingy, you're not going to get much out of that relationship. Um,
Mhm.
you want a boyfriend who's generous. And what the men say is, yeah, being generous is important because if I'm seen as the kind of person who is generous towards both my own kids who are not biologically mine or towards my girlfriend's kids, people see that and they respect me for that. And they get sort of cachet among the men in other kinds of decision-making contexts. And so again, this is like another sort of reinforcing norm that sort of helps the system to work, right? They're sort of rewarded for being a good guy towards these kids that everybody knows are not their kids.
Right. And is that in part because number one, it's just sort of in some sense, it's like just resource status competition, just writ large. So sort of, like it's intrinsically like, if David has more stuff than I do, it's easy to get a norm around like, people preferring the person who has more stuff because the person who has more stuff can sort of coerce or, curry favor, like that just sort of intrinsic. But is it also because those are also then norms. So if I'm that help the biological father too, right? So in the sense of if my son is being taken care of by other men, right? I would almost imagine, and I wonder if this ever happens, where do the do this does the biological father ever talk to the social father and just sort of say, hey, I noticed, you didn't give my son this, like maybe that's too explicit, but like, is that ever happen where, you're kind of monitoring your kid
Hmm.
and how the social father is treating your
That's
kid?
fascinating. Yeah, I would imagine that the biological father has an incentive to enforce this norm that the
Exactly.
marital father should
Yeah.
treat the kids equally because he has a stake in that outcome being
Yeah.
maintained.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think it's more unspoken than spoken, right? So I
Yeah.
don't
hmm.
think that you have a lot of boyfriends and husbands negotiating these things individually, right?
Right.
Like that the sort of norm seems to be
They stay out of
I
each other's
know you're the
business.
boyfriend, but we're not going to talk about it,
Yeah.
right?
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think that yes, in general, there is this sort of system of indirect reciprocity going on underlying this. And I've talked to Kim Hill about this with the Ache, who also
Mm.
have this system of partible paternity, which is similar, where the women have multiple fathers sort of linked to these kids.
Mm.
And so you just sort of generally know, right? Like I'm taking care of some kids who may not be mine, but somebody else is taking care of my kids in their family. And so,
Right.
yes, everybody is sort of enforcing this norm that we should treat them equally helps me either now or in the future, right? So I think what's interesting about it is that for the young men, they're counting on the older men doing that for them, right? And
Right.
when you get older, you should have more incentive when you get older to then be like, well, I'm probably not, I guess, having any more extramarital kids, although you might have extramarital kids still living in other compounds, right?
Right.
That's really
But
interesting.
um,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's like a straightforward application of reciprocal altruism, but where the resource being reciprocated is parental investment, and there's an indirect reciprocity system. And cheating would be the equivalent of, reneging on that deal
Yeah.
neglecting my non-biological kids. It's a really interesting
yeah,
example of that. That's so cool.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's not I mean, it can't be private. I mean, this maybe is one of the reasons why it's as you say, like you're saying, it's just out in the open, right? It's really hard. And maybe I mean, maybe this is the point with the money, right? Is that
yeah,
to the extent that it's policeable or visible, you can see the dynamics staying stable.
yeah, yeah. It's really, I mean, I was not a person who studied norms or anything when I
Yeah.
started doing this, but it seems to be like the having those norms built in really is like the glue that makes the system work.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
really lovely example of, I mean, just like to cut through, it's so complicated if you poke on it. It's like this web of like all these stable, but it's really
Yeah,
just like there's a lot of people who are just worried about like, am I getting screwed or not? And there's a stable norm to the extent that everyone's sort of like, I think I'm okay. Like my overall costs and benefits are sort of like aligned with everyone else's. And if that's true, then we can be okay. And there's lots of different ways to get there. And this is an interesting portion of the possibility space. Yeah.
yeah. And I think
Yeah.
that's where the infusion of the cash economy is going to be so interesting because is
Right.
that going to be kind of the thread that you start to pull where now people can kind of sneak money in different ways, they can invest differently, that may shift their mindset, right? So it's like, is that going to be the string that you start pulling on it and it unravels the whole sweater kind of thing?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one question I have is like, what do kids think about all of this? Obviously, as they get older, the kids turn into adults and then you talk to the adults, but what do the kids think about this?
I mean, the kids seem like they're aware too, right? Again, like I mean, I guess I haven't asked the kids when they are kids whether they
Right.
know. Like that seemed like sort of like
Yeah. I mean,
unethical ask a
that's a
kid,
trick.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But but what the adults tell me is that the kids know and they will reflect back on their childhoods and they'll say
Right.
like, yeah, I've always known that so and so was my father. And when I was a
Yeah.
kid, if I would run into him, because they don't maybe see them as frequently, right? But if I'd see him, he would always give me a little bit of meat or he would,
Mm, yeah.
whatever, buy me a
Yeah.
Coke if we were both in
Yeah.
town, something
Yeah.
like that. So
Yeah.
they seem to be, it doesn't seem to trouble them. I think again because there isn't a stigma about it, they aren't too worried about it. I mean, you do, and what some of the kids have also interestingly said was Sometimes, of course, people are people, right? Some men are going to be more or less jealous than others. And so we had a vignette about the investment stuff where the vignette was about, the father comes home from a funeral and he's bringing a bunch of meat because they slaughter cows at funerals. And the non-biological kid runs up to him and asks him for some meat and he says no. And
Mm,
then later he's sitting and his biological kid comes up to him and he offers that kid some meat, right? So that's our, like, there's a
right.
Hmm.
direct bias. Is this okay or not okay? Right. And then one of the questions we asked them after that was just, we asked them, is this okay or not okay? How often do you think this happens? Right.
Hmm.
And then, um, what would happen to somebody if they did that? And then we asked them if they know of any, tell
Mm,
us a story about this if you have one,
Hmm.
trying to get the sort of ethnographic color. And a lot of the people said, like, yeah, either they were in that position or they know of that kind of thing. So that was the norms were very strong. The behavior was more mixed, as you would expect, right?
right.
And people would say, like, yeah, that happens. But the other thing people would say, to your point, was it's the men sometimes start off with a bias against their non-biological kids, right? Especially men who maybe are more jealous or jealous of
Right.
the particular boyfriend or the particular wife who they maybe, love more than their other wives or something. But a lot of times those kids, if they're really hard workers in the compound, they become their father's favorite kid,
Yeah.
right? So this again, these things are really dynamic.
Yeah.
And so just because, he might have a bias going in, but you can sort of overcome that. But sort of what you would expect from an evolutionary perspective, there's more of a hurdle to overcome, right?
Right.
Because
Hmm.
you do have the non-paternity sort of working against you. So
Right.
you've got as kind of good a situation as you can get with having all these norms in place, but there are still biases. It's not like we found no biases at all in the behavior.
Right. But if the kids expect it, I mean, there's this thing called like the Cinderella effect, right? Like based on the Cinderella story, which is just like, the the non-biological kid gets treated really poorly like Cinderella, right? And then
Yeah,
she gets,
yeah,
swept up and all is right with the world, right? And we empathize with Cinderella. But I mean, it's also the thing of if the kids sort of understand or calibrated to, this is my social dad. I'm not going to get invested as much as the biological kid next to me. Then if you're calibrated to that, then you're also not pissed off, right? You're not feeling entitled to that to some degree. So that might actually kind of counterintuitively quell that. And the thing you said about the even all else equal though, the social relationship you have with the kid changes things. I think is really interesting. I think really understudied because, I mean, there's this whole question of like, why is there so much paternity investment, or why do parents? I mean, like the fact that dads say like, I want to be with my kids, and it's really important like I have an influence on my kids is like a very universal. Well, maybe I mean, but like to some extent. And I think that's really interesting from the perspective of the kind of social affordances your kids have or your social welfare going forward. And I think the sort of abstract social relationship that fathers have with their kids or the way that kids embody their father's aspirations for social status and social respect and resources and coalitional support is really understudied. And I think what you're describing in terms of wanting that is really interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
So I want to talk about how your work fits in with the prevailing ideas in evolutionary psychology. So there's a lot of work on sexual jealousy,
Mm,
and sexual possessiveness, of women by men. And the evolutionary logic there is pretty straightforward in that men face this adaptive problem of ensuring paternity certainty. Women do not have to ensure maternity certainty. If it comes out of your body, it's your kid. There's this saying, mama's baby, papa's maybe.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of work in evolutionary psychology basically arguing that because men face this unique problem of ensuring paternity certainty, that they have evolved mechanisms of sexual jealousy and sexual possessiveness. There's a lot of empirical work showing that men tend to show a greater sensitivity toward sexual infidelities relative to other kinds of emotional infidelities, like having feelings for someone else. And in fact, I believe you've replicated this finding among the Himba. So I'm curious where you think your work fits into this picture. If it does fit in, how, if it challenges certain parts of it, which parts do you think it challenges and which parts do we need to rethink?
Yeah. So I had sort of the same instinct that you did, that this would be a really interesting population to look at this, right?
Yeah.
Because we most of the studies of this had been done either in weird societies, or if it was non-weird societies, it was still typically sort of university populations in the global south or something. And
Mhm.
nobody had done it in a small scale society at the time that I did it with him, but I think.
Mhm.
Um, and I didn't know what I was going to find. I went in sort of agnostic, right? I'm trained as an evolutionary anthropologist, but not an evolutionary psychologist. So I was, but I was open, right? I thought, let's see what we find. And we found, I think, two important things that spurred me to think about this more. The first was we did replicate the sort of standard bus effect, right? Where men more than women were upset by sexual jealousy, sexual infidelity more than emotional infidelity.
Mhm.
But the other thing that we found was that both men and women were more upset by sexual infidelity than emotional infidelity. So there was a sex difference. It was like
Mhm.
96, 90 something percent of men were more upset by the sex,
Mhm.
but like 67% of women or something like that were more upset. So, right. So it was,
Mhm.
the majority of both were more upset by sexual infidelity. And that looks
Mhm.
really different than like the US, where have a sex difference, but it's more like 40-10 or something, right? Where like,
Right.
because you've got like actually the majority of both men and women more upset by emotional infidelity, but
Mhm.
just more men than women were upset by the sexual infidelity, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah.
So to me, that part was underappreciated, right? So
Yeah.
like, yes, we found the sex difference. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like I think
Mhm.
that that's real.
Yeah.
Um, but I just think that we've gotten so myopic in the jealousy literature in particular of like focusing on this sex difference and then just like finding the teeny tiny
Yes.
variations of ways that we can test this,
Yeah.
that we lost the other important things that we could learn about jealousy.
Mhm.
So I then went out and recruited a bunch of anthropologists who were working and importantly, had been working in the places that they worked for long periods of time. I think it was like our average was like 11 years that people had been working at their field sites because I wanted people who could help to sort of group think about why you might see variation in these kinds of things. So we did run that forced choice experiment about which is more upsetting to you, but we also looked at the severity of, how good or bad is it that, if a partner does this with the different kinds of jealousy. Because let me take one step back. So when I was doing this first with Himba, the other thing that would often happen is, it's a forced choice, right? So you say, which is more upsetting to you if your partner has sex with someone else or if they fall in love with someone else.
Mhm.
And and you tell them that both things happen, which part is more upsetting. And a
Mhm.
lot of Himba, maybe unsurprisingly, given everything I've told you, said it's fine. Both both are fine, right? And I really had to push them
Hmm.
to to
Hmm.
pick one, right?
Interesting.
And so that also, again, is a signal like, yeah, that's very different, right? Whereas if you ask this to Americans, they would say both are horrible, right? But
That's
if I
fascinating.
had to pick which is worse, right? But it's a very different sort of starting point. So
Right. So, did you ask, sorry, just to clarify, did you ask this question in regard to people's social spouse or in regard to their boyfriend or girlfriend?
we asked it about their husband or wife.
Got
Yeah.
it. Okay. It would be interesting to look to see if you would get different results if you asked it about their boyfriend or girlfriend.
I guess well, I'm trying to think because there probably were some unmarried people in the sample, so I'd have to
Oh,
look back
okay.
the actual wording was, but
Mm,
it was
Okay.
supposed to be like it was a long-term partner, not a short-term partner
Got it.
that we're
Okay.
asking
right.
about. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And so we went out and replicated this, and we had the Chamane and the Hadza and all the Mosu who
Hmm.
also have this sort of walking marriage and
Hmm.
less more informal partnerships. So we wanted to have sort of a range of societies that we chose for reasons that we thought might matter.
Hmm.
Um, and and then we ran these questions about both how upset you were about different kinds of infidelity and then also the forced choice. And we did find I think the Chamane, both men and women, like 100% said they were more upset by the sex. So there was
Hmm.
no difference.
It's just
But
ceiling effect or something.
there
Yeah.
was just a
Interesting.
ceiling effect. But for the most part, across all these cultures, the sex difference was there, right? So
Got it.
that's the thing that, like, I mean, like I've heard David Buss talk about this, right? Like he likes
Yeah.
it, right? Because
Yeah.
it does reinforce the original hypothesis, which is fine. I like
Yeah.
again, I'm
Yeah.
not, but to me, the most important thing was how much variation there was in the sort of
Hmm.
severity of responses. And then what we tried to do was not just say there is variation, but try
Mm,
to understand what is driving that variation.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we found was that paternal investment was one of the things that was driving it. So because we had anthropologists who'd been working in these places for a long time, we came up with this sort of survey to be able to ask the anthropologists, how much we didn't have behavioral measures of paternal investment that were equal across all these different places, right? So we had to sort of deal with the fact that there were foragers and pastoralists and agriculturalists, and we had like, market integrated people in Okinawa and in the US. But we asked sort of about different realms of paternal investment and had this sort of paternal investment score. And that really mattered for the severity of response, right? So the
mm,
more paternal investment there was, the more people were upset about infidelity.
The
Um,
right.
paternal investment in the particular relationship that was being discussed, because you could in the Himba, for example, there are norms that the man should be investing in his wife's kids, but there aren't the same norms that he should be investing in his girlfriend's kids. So
yeah, this was
by your
about
logic, you would expect different jealousy responses depending on which partner was being evaluated.
yes, that's true. Although we didn't actually specifically look at that. So this was more about like your wife's kid, like
Got it.
your social kids, right?
Right. Okay.
But it would be that Himba would score on the lower end because they're not giving there's no the inherited wealth is going to the nephews, right? So on
Got it.
that form of paternal investment, they're going to score quite low. Uh,
Hmm.
Whereas if they had father to child inheritance of some kind, they would score higher. But we looked at both inheritance norms, we looked at sort of direct care, like, so this is where it's helpful to have anthropologists who could say, like, yeah, dads are doing a lot of, direct caretaking, kids sitting on their laps, helping with feeding, helping with.
Hmm.
So we had sort of different measures, and then we combined them all in sort of a score.
Yeah, I
Cool.
like that the focus on the sex difference at the expense of the variation. That's
Yes.
important not only because we don't want to just focus on, well, there's a sex difference, but even from an evolutionary psychological perspective, it tells us about the design of jealousy, right? And so
Right.
like what you're saying is the fact that there's this variation suggests that in that it's a function of parental investment is that it comes back to this sort of basic deeper thing of am I being screwed over, so it's
Right.
sort of like this thing of like if I'm investing then I'm angry, an analogous thing would be sort of like the theory that like if somebody takes my land I'm going to be angry, but that's actually going to be calibrated by whether or not I've invested in that land. Like if it's just my land, but I don't get anything out of it, I've never invested anything in it, versus my livelihood is tied up into it and I've invested for years or generations in it, I'm going to have a very different anger response. And so
Right.
if you have your theory is like people get angry when somebody takes their land, that's not as good of a theory as like you're angry when it's about investment. And it sounds like what you're describing, it really makes jealousy more sophisticated in this sort of investment dependent way.
Yeah, it's not an anti-evolutionary finding to show
Right.
that culture
Yeah.
matters,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
It's
Exactly.
Yeah.
like I think that's I think the false dichotomy, right? Of
Yes.
the
Yes.
kind of it's an
Exactly.
evolutionary explanation or a cultural explanation. No, no, no.
Yeah.
Like that's what I
Exactly.
try to tell my students from day one, right?
Yeah.
That
Mhm.
like but understanding how these cultural systems work to sort
Yeah.
of reinforce the evolutionary logic. So, but I mean that's I think one of the sort of frustrations for me with so much of the mating research that's out there is just we're, I understand that the sex differences stuff is easier to test. And
Yeah.
so, and I think Dan Conroy Beam talked about this too when
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
guys come on, right? But it's like we've gotten so myopic where we're
Yeah.
just really focused on these sex differences and it's not the end all be all of understanding our mating behavior. Like we need to,
Yeah.
and I think we all know this, and yet people keep grasping for it and then doing these sort of
Yeah.
small derivations of studies instead of, it's not just that they're not seeing the forest for the trees, it's that they like picked one tree and like we
Yeah.
know everything there is to know about this one tree
Yeah.
and we're, ignoring everything else. And I think so to me that was the more important part of that jealousy paper was not that we found, support for the bus hypothesis across a
Yeah.
bunch of small scale populations. It was
Yeah.
that we found these other important things and we should be paying attention to those too.
Yeah. I think we haven't really talked so much about this, but I think this is a really important point is I think from a very naive perspective, people think about evolution as the little parts of you that are not rational. Right.
Hmm.
And so it's this idea, like, and I think, Brooke, what you're describing, it's very conducive to being appealing, which is sort of like, well, people, of course, just like rationally follow costs and benefits. And it's only those little things that like don't make sense from like a cost benefit perspective that our evolution or evolution can tell us about. And I think
Yeah.
there's a kernel of truth to that, which is that if there is this evolved design and if it's running even counter to modern costs and benefits, then like, yeah, why else would it be there? But it makes this fallacy that the cost and benefit stuff, like in this case of like jealousy is a function of how much investment, that's also evolved design too. And so
Yes.
I think that this comes back to like a very fundamental misunderstanding that oftentimes outsiders or untrained people have. But then it also then means that that kind of work that's framed that way is more appealing because it just appeals to this like I mean, frankly, uneducated perspective that evolution isn't the little person in my head. It's the things that are tugging on the little person. Like it's the thing that makes me want chocolate, even though I don't want it, or it's the thing that makes me want to like have sex with the person, even though I don't want to. So it's like the things pulling on the homunculus, as they say.
Yeah, yeah.
And it sounds like this is exactly sort of what you're talking about in this perspective. And I think it explains. To maybe I don't have data for this, so it's slightly, I'm sort of editorializing a bit, but I suspect some of the history of that is that that was sort of what was fitting with this sort of view of sort of if there's a rational reason for it, if there's a cost benefit logic to it, especially in that first wave of psych, you had to
Yeah.
stick with that stuff. And I think David's work is a great example of like the second wave where it's like, no, everything that's cost and benefits, we can take an evolutionary approach and not only just post hoc explain it, but actually derive new predictions. But yeah, I think you're treading in like you've poked on a very deep fundamental issue in the field. I'll just end with that. Yeah.
But I think too, it's like when you're a graduate student and you come in, you're trying to figure out your dissertation topic, the push is find something counterintuitive, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of emphasis on, like Dan Fessler always says to, like, why should I care, right? Like, and
Yeah.
I and I think he's right to push on that, right? But I think a lot of that comes from, well, if I can come up with something that's counterintuitive, then that's
Yeah.
a real why should
Yeah.
I care moment,
Yeah.
right? I, that's fine if you come up with something like that, right? But I think the idea, like to me, it never sat quite right because there are plenty of things just because something is intuitive or maps onto what we think doesn't mean that there isn't a good evolutionary explanation for why we're doing that thing. And it may have to do with the fact that the costs and benefits are, aligned in that particular way. And I mean, I think this is where behavioral ecology shines, is in
Mm,
thinking about some
yeah.
of that stuff and looking at the variation and why we might expect there to be variation. And it often does, like, it makes sense, right? So sometimes
Yeah.
when you paint it out, it really is sort of
Yeah.
intuitive in that it's not, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? You can
Yeah.
still really important insights into our behavior,
Yeah. Or
even if
even, I mean, and
it's
yeah.
intuitive.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. I mean, because I would even put it more strongly, which is like, I think psychologists who don't interact with human behavioral ecologists really fall into that trap. So,
Yeah.
if you're a human behavioral ecologist and you're like, well, from a psychological perspective, well, what's more obvious than like feeding yourself, right? But a human behavioral ecologist is like not trivial. Like you got to go out, you expend calories, calculation of like what's the return on it, what's the processing, whatever, and that keeps the psychologist um, honest, because then you're like, oh, if I'm an evolutionary psychologist, I can't just trivialize that it's easy to get food. There's actually software for calculating like foraging time and the costs I'm incurring and the handling time and the return rate and like all this decision making that like the human behavioral ecologist is telling me as a psychologist I have to look for in the mind. And
Yeah,
so I think like I would actually put it more strongly that I think especially the evolutionary social sciences have to keep that relationship. To the extent that they don't, it really runs this risk of running this like, well, if your grandmother couldn't tell you, as a paper published in the psychology journal. I think just to there's a paper in a psychology journal that's a theoretical paper that I think should be retracted. And I think it's this paper that is uh, by Kurt Gray and somebody else, and it's about I think it's Dan Gilbert, and it's about like you should do research that's surprising and that your grandmother couldn't tell you about. And everybody has like said that's not great, but I think it actually should be retracted. It should be made an example
Yeah.
of, and it's exactly for this reason. And I think like human behavioral ecologists and anthropology and evolution is what keeps us honest to asking really important questions about basic things,
yeah.
like how
Yeah.
do you not starve,
Yeah.
right?
And
It's in fact it's even worse than uninsightful or unproductive. It's actually the opposite of what we should be doing. Because if you think
Exactly.
about doing science from a Bayesian perspective, you want to
Yeah,
pursue
totally.
hypotheses with a high prior
Yeah,
probability of being correct. But if you're searching for the surprising counterintuitive
yeah,
hypotheses, those are by definition the ones with the lowest probability of being correct.
yeah,
And so what you've produced by with that perverse incentive structure is a false positive machine, right? You're
totally.
going out and you're testing all the low probability hypotheses,
Yeah,
and by chance a few of them will turn up some positive results. And what you're getting is a bunch of surprising and false findings. It's no surprise at all that this
yeah,
is leading to a replication crisis. But anyway, sorry,
yeah,
Brooke, I interrupted
yeah,
you.
oh, it's okay. I mean, I think I would add just one more layer to it, which is that it's adding in the cultural evolution layer on top,
mm,
right?
Mhm.
Which is, so I think the behavioral ecologists, the sort of old school first generation, second generation, even behavioral ecologists, were really focused on those rules about the ecology, right? The
yes,
ecology and the behavioral ecology,
yes,
and sort of all the conditional strategies based on
mm,
those kinds of factors, and often black boxing the culture, right? And I
Mhm.
think that the next step is then layering in things like norms and why, because sometimes those are helping us to, like I said, they're sort of the glue that's helping to enforce these things and help these things that may be sort of counterintuitive, like how do we get to cooperate in these
yeah,
really large groups, or how do we sustain a system with extra pair paternity, right? And so I think that's where we need to sort of complete the circle of these three different perspectives becoming more integrative. And for me, being at UCLA was like mind blowing in that way,
yeah,
because I was really, I was trained by Eric Galton Smith, who's, one of the, foremost early human behavioral ecologists, right? And not that he hasn't also integrated this stuff, right? But a lot of his early work was that sort of bread and butter behavioral ecology in a foraging population. And but that was what I was trained in. I never had any no psychology training, really no cultural evolution training. And then I got to UCLA, and it was the time when Rob Boyd was still there,
Hmm.
and so we had Dan and Clark and Rob, and I was like the lone behavioral ecologist, human behavioral ecologist in the department, and I
Mm.
was like, I felt like I went back to kindergarten, really,
Mm,
when I
interesting.
started as
Yeah.
a faculty member, because I was like, oh gosh, okay, I have to learn all this stuff. I have to learn all this new language, these new perspectives. But, in a lot of ways, feel like I've had more sort of growth as a scholar in the faculty part of my career because of that, because I
Yeah.
sort of had to exercise all these new muscles and think about how we could integrate these different perspectives. And it's been, I see a lot of that in like now I'm old, like in the generation below mine, of the like I think people are naturally, at least the behavioral ecologists, I think that's what I know best. I don't know whether this is, you can tell me whether you think this is true in psychology, but human behavioral ecologists, I think, are more naturally drawing from these different fields and integrating them more in their projects in really, really cool, exciting ways. Um, I wish, I guess my stereotypical bias is that it's happening less in psychology, at least from like when you look at like the HBES program, just in terms of the titles and stuff like that. But I don't know. Do you think that's happening? I'm gonna ask you a question. Do you think that's happening in psychology too?
David, do you want to, I mean, we
Uh,
can both.
I,
Yeah.
I mean, so could you get clear on the question?
Yeah. Do you
What are
think
you?
that do you
Yeah.
think that evolutionary psychologists are increasingly integrating perspectives from behavioral ecology and cultural evolution, or are they
Mhm.
still sort of
Yeah.
siloed off?
Yeah. I'm,
It depends. I mean, so I think yes, but it's happening more slowly than I would like. I think slowly but surely we are integrating and merging together the various good ideas. But progress is slow, and particularly in the social sciences. It happens very slowly. So I'd like it to speed up. But yeah, I do see quite a bit of it. Maybe it's just from my background at UCLA, where that's sort of a really great example of a bunch of different perspectives feeding into each other in a productive way. Not every department is like that. So I don't know, but yes, I've seen some of it. I wish there were more. I don't know. What do you think, Dave?
yeah. I mean, and I came from, I was a student of Lita Cosby's John Tooby, and I was there. I'm a generation after Clark, and I was sort of on the end where I still had a lot of interaction with Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson. And I think in Christina Moya we had on, and I talked to Christina Moya about this. Christina Moya and I spent a lot of time as representatives of sort of John and Lita and Rob and Pete, respectively, sort
Sort
of.
of
And I think,
diplomats between the
yeah,
two
exactly.
the two
No,
nations.
we did.
Yeah.
We really spent a lot of time together.
Yeah.
But and Sarah Matthew too, and other people. But I think what it is I don't think the generation now. I don't think there's any there's very little disagreement, I think, anymore. And I think it's largely a division of labor, where I
Yeah.
think a lot of evolutionary psychologists understand the importance of cultural evolution, but they would view their work as sort of prior to that, in the sense of they're still just interested in the evolved design, independent of which norms are feeding into it by and large. Now, there are certain evolutionary psychologists who are really interested in, like, why is a particular place the way it is, or why are particular norms the way they are. And the more you know about the psychology, you can predict what the norms are. And the more you appreciate that there's cultural evolution, like as in your work, we were just talking about the whole first part of this was there's all these costs and benefits, right? And so your if, for example, just to make it concrete, if an evolutionary psychologist just went to your field site and never looked at any other variation in humans, they might make inferences about the evolved design of human software that would not be as accurate if they didn't realize that some of this was a consequence of coordinated norms, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the question of sort of like, and so it makes your evolutionary psychology better, because then you can ask the question, well, like, where do those norms come from? And I think boy, like Rob and Pete's insight was in the same way that John and Lita, for example, and other people, I mean, there were Smith and Winterhalter were talking about evolved design in 95 too. Like they're even human behavioral ecologists were talking about the evolved psychology. But the insight of sort of I'm not satisfied with the mind just is the way that is. We want an evolutionary explanation. Rob and Pete were saying, well, we just don't want to say culture is the way it is. We want a causal explanation as well. And I think that for, in the same way, like an old school evolutionary psychologist may say, well, those are just norms and they are just the way they are, and that's culture, but we're interested in the evolved design. The new school is sort of like, no, the norms come from the evolved psychology too. It loops around. So I think that's my long-winded way of saying it's in practice, it might be that evolutionary psychologists do de-emphasize the norm dynamics, but I don't know any of them that aren't excited or interested when a cultural evolutionist then picks up the evolved design they're talking about and sort of talks about the dynamics those things create. And there are some people starting to do that where they think about what are the dynamics the design creates as a way to think about the design itself. I don't know if that's helpful, but
Yeah, it is, but I want to pick up on something you said in the middle there, which was that, if evolutionary psychology got its origins in Namibia with the Himba, right? They
yeah,
might different evolutionary psychology might look different.
yeah,
But I
Yeah.
mean, I think the counterpoint to that is we have to then understand that evolutionary psychology looks the way that it does because it was created in a weird world, right? So
yeah,
like
Yeah.
that
totally. Yeah, yeah,
had a big contribution, right? Is that like, and so I think that's where the anthropology is so important because we need to keep pushing on this idea of like, is this evolved psychology or
yeah,
not?
yeah,
Right?
no,
Like,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah,
and we can only answer that question if we keep looking at this, across cultures, and we sort of, I think, also build in the idea that we are flexible. Like part of our
yeah,
evolved psychology is that we're
yeah,
flexible and
yeah,
we
Yeah.
are a social species
yeah,
who we don't know what the norms were, right? 10,000 years ago or 20 or 100,000 years ago, but we probably had some, right? And so I think assuming that the very specific psychology that we have and we were raised with and that's helping us come up with those predictions, I just think we always need to push on that and
yeah.
question.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a fractal issue too, which is sort of like from a even old school quote unquote John and Lita of psych was very cross-cultural. Like they had, the Clark, the Schwarzschild. And so compared to psychologists, I was saying this, Christina, like I went after UCSB, I went to another university, a psych department had no anthropologist, and I was like I did the ethnographic veto all the time. I was just like, that's
Hmm.
not true. That's not universal. Like there's this
Yeah,
other
Yeah.
culture. Like I was just like, what is
Yeah.
this? These people are making claims. So I think I agree that like even currently evolutionary psychology could still be more cross-cultural, but then I can imagine a lot of evolutionary psychologists listening being like, yeah, but compared to regular psychologists, we're already super not weird. And we were super
Yeah.
not weird way before the weird paper. So I think like, I think everybody's doing their best.
yeah,
But I do think, I really do strongly feel that and I've said this before, it would be terrible if field and behavioral ecology work doesn't stay together with ev psych. And I would not want to be in an evolutionary psychology or evolutionary behavioral sciences where like the psychologists don't interact with the behavioral ecologists or the cultural evolutionists. And I think to the degree that they're separated, it's not healthy for either side.
yeah. And I think it's just, I mean, I think that in people often think of this as like, okay, now I need to go and test my pet hypothesis in some other place, right? And
Yeah.
if I can find it in the
Yeah.
shore and in the
Yeah.
US, therefore it's universal, right? And
Yeah.
I mean, yes, and I can talk about the sort of logistical hurdles of doing that, right? Because I don't think that necessarily like helicoptering in and throwing your study design that was designed in the
Yeah.
West without thinking through how it may or may not be working the way you think it's working is a good idea.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But I think that the conversations, like I mean, same at UCSB, right, where you've got John and Lita, and then you've got Mike, and right, so these play. It's
Yeah.
to me the more important thing. was like keeping your mind fresh and thinking about these things by always having people say, but what about this? But what about
Yeah.
this? And so it's having developing kind of, at UCLA we have Beck, which is our
Yeah.
behavior, evolution, and culture series, right? And where we try to bring in people, but different ways to be able to bring those voices together. And that's to me matters almost more than like doing a cross-cultural experiment and having that be a chapter of your dissertation,
Yeah.
because it's about, exercising those muscles and thinking about it from like always having those other voices in your head. I think that helps reframe the way you think about all of this. And as opposed to just sort of trying to reinforce the beliefs that you already have by saying like, oh, I'm going to drop in and go do this study somewhere else, or ask some behavioral ecologist to run this with the Hadza or the Himba
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's this misguided way of thinking of doing cross-cultural research as a cudgel, as a way of saying, aha, see, it's universal.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
told you
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
Whereas what we should be doing as psychologists is trying to explain that cultural variation and show what is at the root of it and how the mind is strategically responding to context to produce that variation. We seem to forget as social scientists that the reason we have brains is precisely to do this kind of flexible, contingent cost benefit analysis that helps us respond to the subtleties of our particular circumstances. You know, a plant doesn't need a brain because it just does photosynthesis regardless of where it is.
Right.
Once you start having, a body and multiple things to do and multiple courses of action to take that are dependent on where you are and what's going on in your environment, you need a brain. That's why we have them. That's why we have the things that we're studying, so that we can precisely respond to these kinds of subtle distinctions in our environments and our social norms, etc. We should be interested in how the mind does that, not trying to look at how the mind does not do that. Right?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a very different. I mean, I think it's a humble approach, right? It's sort of it's like it's going in and being like, do we have theories to explain this?
Yeah.
Right? Like, do we have psychological theories to explain this or not? And I think the tradition in psychology that's very domain general, that's sort of like reasoning and rationality, is also like a very it's also conveniently sort of like a very like not to get too anthro, but almost sort of like imperial or colonial, where it's sort of like um, reasoning is hard. We do it in modern circumstances with money and math and spaceships, and these people who are digging in the dirt don't do it. And so we don't even have to study them because they don't even embody what the hard things the mind does is,
I
right?
hope that's not the
Right, but
case.
I think, but you can really see like it's a very domain general view of the mind, which is sort of like reasoning is the pinnacle of what we study, and math and like trigonometry is explicit math and trigonometry, the kind we learn in schools. Like you can see how that very conveniently means you don't even have to study other people, right? Because it's like there's not even interesting data there. It's a very different way. And I actually think an evolutionary approach does this very thoroughly, is it completely inverts that and says trigonometry and spaceships don't matter at all. That's not hard at all. What's really hard is like having a kid and having them not die. And then it
Yeah.
completely inverts like who you have to be humble to, and you have to go around and be like, how do people keep their kids alive? That completely changes like who you follow, what questions you ask, what data you collect. And as psychologists, we should just be like, do we have theories of like, your Brooke, your social network? Like, no, we don't. So we're still failing. Like every time we have an anthropologist on, I'm like, we really don't have very much yet. Yeah.
I mean, I mean, anthropology makes you humble in
Yeah.
a way that maybe is less common in psychology, right? Because you're sort of
Yeah.
forced,
Yeah.
at least to go to a place where you know nothing, and all
Yeah.
of your sort of intuitions about how the world works are often like, if they're not turned on their heads, they're at least turned 90 degrees or 30 degrees or something, right? And
Yeah.
so it's and you sort of have to figure it all out from the ground up, right? And so there are things, I mean, for me, when I was talking to people about their relationships, like the idea that people were adamant about the idea that you could be in love with multiple people at once, right? Like things like that that I was like, what? Like that's not real, right? Like that, and so you, you're sort of forced to have to keep your mind flexible in a way that I think helps the science, right? Whereas if you're talking to people, if you're working with undergraduates whose minds all work pretty much the way that your mind works, right? You're
Yeah.
not sort of forced in the same way to have to flex those muscles and figure out, you're challenged to have to think about how these things work. And um that to me
Yeah.
is that to me is the fun of it, right?
Yeah.
Is that like it's that's the exciting part. It's challenging, but that's also, what what keeps me in it, I think, is that it's so fascinating to sit down and talk to some old guy for 2 hours and come away being like, whoa, that is not the way I thought about the world. And yet like it makes sense and it like, right, but it really, forces you to keep your mind open.
Yeah. You're one of the editors of the Human Behavioral Ecology book. How do you think about where the field is going, where it's headed? Is it healthy, or in our psychologists doing their part, or are we failing?
I I think it's I think the more integrative it is, the healthier it is. And so we did in this book want to have so this book was still meant to be it's called human behavioral ecology, right? And so it was meant to give you that perspective first and foremost. But and so there are chapters and there's an evolutionary psychology chapter, there's a cultural evolution chapter, and there's like a human biology chapter. And in an ideal world, the book would the book would be evolutionary social sciences or something,
Right.
and the whole book would be more integrated, right? But that wasn't really the goal for this
Right.
book. This book was like we wanted to sort of give an update to the 1992 Smith and Winterhalter, what we call the
Yeah.
Green Bible,
It's a
right?
great book. I have it
Yeah,
on my shelf behind me. Yeah.
yep,
I
yep.
love it
So
from Mike
it's
Irvin's class. Yeah.
and it's great, right? And so we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We wanted this to be, so what does it look like 25 years later? But and so each chapter is more integrative, I think, but it's still mainly, it's like 80% HBE kind of thing. But I think that my hope is that the next book finds, would be something that really weaves all three in throughout, right? And gives a more integrated perspective throughout. And I think that is happening more. I mean, like I said, most of the behavioral ecologists that I know are um, sort of over those debates that, is it domain specific
Yeah.
versus domain general?
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah.
I think that kind of like universal versus
Yeah.
variation, right? Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
to me, like those debates are kind of tired at this point,
Yeah.
and most of the people who are really actively doing this don't want to just keep recycling those old arguments, but we want to now think like, okay, we understand those are false dichotomies. Now, how do we move forward? And I think that's where we need better methods. We need people talking to each other more, and then we can start to do that. I mean, I think it's I think I still think we need to do it by better communication. I really think is key. So getting psychologists in, it doesn't help that we're in different departments so often, right?
Yeah.
So, you and I, all three of us actually came from universities where those departments were much more integrated with one another.
Yes. UCLA and
Um,
UCSB were gold examples of
yeah,
anthropsych and other department interdisciplinary
yeah.
work. Yeah.
And but I think that trying to sort of encourage that kind, even if you may be housed in different departments, and there are issues about, you know, sort of the incentive structures of publishing in psychology versus anthropology, right? Like I think we're a lot more forgiving in anthropology for being able to sort of take your time and publish a little less, but that, doing field work is hard and long, right?
Yeah.
And that those are real things, right? Like psychologists still have to get tenure in psychology departments, and so you can't ignore the fact that they have a different incentive structure. But I think if you can the conversational part of it, the like get together once a week and hash this stuff out in a joint lab group and that kind
Yeah.
of stuff, like that can happen even if each party still has their own sort of incentive structures about what and where they're going to publish. Like, but getting those conversations to happen more, I think, would be the soapbox I would stand on about how to move the field forward.
Yeah, that's great. It's just connecting people. So it's like John Tooby always talked about science as a bunch of little villages. And it's basically that he was always like, it's so shocking how you think there's these like formal structures, but really it comes down to like who interacts with who on a regular basis. And I mean, it's just exactly what you're talking about is if you don't have regular interaction face to face with people, you're not going to treat them with the kind of thought or even think about what they're thinking about, right? It's just the way to sort of be in each other's minds is to be in each other's faces, I guess,
In
in
the
a nice
beginning
way. Yeah.
of the field was more right when there were
Yeah.
only a few of them.
Yeah.
I think that they were more able to do that, right? Because
Yeah.
there were like you look at that picture of them
Yeah.
at University of Michigan
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
early meeting, right? And it's like
Yeah.
you've got biologists, you've got
Yeah.
psychologists, you've got
Yeah.
anthropologists, like because there weren't very many of them. And I
Yeah.
think maybe that's one of the good things about HBE and the sort of downsides of being an evolutionary psychologist is just the size of the fields, right? So
Yeah.
like HBE just has always been smaller. And so we've been more forced. I mean, I think we always thought about it as like we're on the margins of,
Yeah.
of something like HBAS or something like that. But in some ways that's kept us honest in that we've been forced to have to be a little bit more integrative to sort of, grow our
Yeah.
networks and things like that. Whereas psychologists can be more insular because there's so many of you, right?
Yeah.
And even just the evolutionary psychologists within this bigger field of psychology, there's so many of you.
Yeah.
And so you can sort of silo off and still be surrounded by lots of people and lots of viewpoints. It's just you're not going outside the field as much, right?
Yeah, it's a good example of like you can really fail by succeeding, or even evolutionary psychology. We talked about this with Dan Conroy Beam about how like a lot of psychologists, because have like sort of succeeded in being acceptable, it's become this thing where there's sort of like LaCroix flavored, like just very a light touch of evolution. So it's not adaptationism. It's not asking about adaptive problems or going adaptive problem first or even considering adaptive problems, but it's just sort of like with a little garnish of evolution. And then you get enough people doing that. Again, it's this base rate thing where there's tons of people who do that and a small number of adaptationists. And then you get students coming in, they're like, well, this is all evolutionary psychology, and 80% of it is the weird garnish, right? And that's a concern I certainly feel. So yeah, maybe the secret to success is not succeeding.
And
Yeah,
and then you put sex on top of that, right? So it's
yeah,
like,
I
yeah,
oh,
know.
exactly.
Yeah.
you want to
Yeah,
get undergraduates interested in taking a
yeah,
course with
Yeah.
sex in the title,
no,
right?
Sex
that's
and sex
true.
differences. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep, yep,
yeah,
Yeah.
yep. And because again, going back to the intuition thing, like everybody, right? They take that class and like, this it totally explains why my
yeah,
boyfriend did what he did, or this,
yeah,
like everybody loves to sort of to do this, but it and that grows, right? Everybody, it's harder to do the anthropology. It's not as cut and dry. Like I feel like my poor students, it's like they come to me with something like that, and I'm like, yeah, maybe this explains
yeah,
why your boyfriend's doing what they're doing, right? But I always try to sort of like temper those things when they come into my office with things like that because it's like I don't want to reinforce this kind of pop psychology explanation for all these things.
yeah. I mean, I think there's a trade-off between if you come in with no thought about it and then you really discover the insights and you're excited about it, that's a wonderful thing. But
Yeah.
that's the early stage to a more mature, grown-up stage, which is, and those are just different things, And I think you have to one wants to respect both things, but exactly right is just sort of saying that's true and that's great, but it's going to be more complicated and let's keep going and not
Yeah.
just sort
Yeah.
of yeah. Do you run into with the work you do? I mean, this might be a transition to you have a paper about like the manosphere and what it gets wrong. And I don't want to either essentialize a whole group of people too. Like I think there's, especially in a modern environment where people, um, uh, and especially like young men feel this deep imperative to be mated. And we talked to Chris von Ruden, and there's always sort of losers in the mating market, and it hurts. And it's like, it's very, like it's I think a lack of empathy for people who feel the pain of like not feeling like the world fits them and they don't understand why they can't be successful in the way they look around that other people are. I think it's a mistake to not empathize with them. But at the same time, that creates a market for bad ideas that aren't either sophisticated or just downright wrong or dangerous. And so, do you have, um, in your experience or in doing this work, like where are you at in terms of like looking at that stuff, or is that something you're not really looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started looking at cuckoldry and there sort of was this natural use of the term and within the manosphere that sort of played on all of that. And I agree about the empathy piece, but I think that there are every it's not just men, right, who
Yeah,
are
exactly.
who are, on the downside of the mating
Yeah,
market is, right? This can go either way, and often cases, I think there's an equal kind of movement of women, particularly as they get older, who are worried about finding a partner and things like that. And the mating market is
yeah,
often against them, right? And yet,
right.
and there is some, small slice of man hating that goes along with some of that too, right? So it's not that this is like only men who have these sort of negative perceptions, but I think some of it, is every. Of course, there are differences in people's eligibility on the mating market and things like that, right? But I think also these things are my concern as the mother of a 12-year-old boy, right?
Mm,
Is that I worry that these things are getting um, thrown at them en masse at such a young age that like the first time they have like a crush who doesn't like them back, and they could
yeah,
like spiral into this
yeah,
this sort of dark web
yeah,
of explanations for why that happened to them. And in reality, like these are just blips that happen to everybody
yeah,
over the course of a long love life, right?
yeah, totally.
And so I think that's from a personal perspective,
Yeah,
that's my concern about it, is that it's sort of spinning some extrapolations of this theory where they're, taking some piece and they're spinning it off in a way that it wasn't meant to be, spun off in that way. And they're able to sort of foment all of this kind of misogyny, basically.
yeah,
Um, and I do think that we as scientists have a responsibility, if we are talking about these topics, to get out there and right these wrongs in the science, right? So I wrote that piece in part because I was concerned about the fact that the science was getting written about in an incorrect way. And like that Scientific American piece is more about cuckoldry isn't always what you think it is, right? Like there's this idea that it's about men being tricked and these wily women, and I was trying to sort of counter that with an anthropological perspective. But I think generally we need to not just lean on the excuse of, well, I didn't mean it that way. I only said this one thing, and it's not my fault that people took it and spun it off in this other direction. I think that if this is my bread and butter in terms of my research, that I also have a responsibility to explicitly say what I think it does and doesn't mean. And that to me is personally important, like in terms of like the way that I think about doing science.
yeah. Do you think that people, I mean, because there, I can see two arguments. One is that people lean on it because it serves their interests and they don't care if there's science behind it or not. And there's another argument where people lean on it, but other people believe them because it has a scientific credibility. And maybe both things happen. I have no idea, and I don't know to what extent like this is knowable, but like, I've heard people sort of say, well, it doesn't matter what scientists say because they don't care. Like they would just use this towards their own ends anyway. And I actually don't know what I think about that answer. I mean, I guess it's sort of just very much like an excuse to not do anything, but I don't know. Do you have a thought about that? Or, I mean, maybe it's sort of obvious that it's just sort of, well, we have to do our best.
I mean, I think that there are people very explicitly using the sign, like picking little pieces of these papers and trying to use them to
Yeah.
justify it. So I think that I don't know what percentage of the audience cares
Yeah.
about that argument versus the other
Right.
part of the argument
Yeah.
or just broader argument,
Yeah.
but I think that it is happening for
Yeah, for
sure.
sure. Yeah,
That they're
that's
doing
undeniable.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that um, you know, we need to course correct that where we can. And I think again, like part of it is my role as a scientist course correcting it, and part of it is my role as a mom course
Yeah.
correcting it, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that it's also, just taking off the scientist hat, like
Yeah.
I'm not having conversations with my 12-year-old necessarily about why the science is wrong as
Yeah.
much as
No,
why,
exactly.
you know,
Yeah.
but I mean more and more, but I think that we need to be aware that this stuff is happening and that they are, I mean, this gets more into arguments about the role of social media and all this kind of
Yeah.
stuff. But I
Yeah.
think that the science is feeding into it and we just I hope that we can also do the science that gets the nuance a little bit more out there too, right? Because I think that with all things, right? It's easier to digest the sound bite of
Yeah.
it, and I worry about our culture being just increasingly soundbite oriented, I guess, right? It's not just like the cuckoldry stuff is one example of that, but I think
Yeah.
this is a bigger problem that I can't solve.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to fight against, because the internet incentivizes the quippy, simplistic soundbite. And the best we could do is, try to at least make the nuance and the real science available for people who are looking for it and want to find it. That's, I think, one of the big impetuses behind this podcast is not to, condense the science into a soundbite or into, a talking point for one or another ideology, but to just give people a real glimpse of what the science is like, warts and all. It may be boring to some people, but that's okay because reality is complicated and nuanced and hard to understand, and it can sometimes overwhelm the puny human mind who is trying to grasp it. And so I think that is one of our goals of putting this stuff out there. Yes, it's going to be hard for it to compete with the more flashy propagandistic stuff that's out there, but at the very least, it is available to be found for the people who want to find it. So as we're approaching the end of our time with you, I'm curious if there's anything you wish that we had talked about that we didn't ask you, any particular topic that you would have loved to delve into.
Oh gosh, see, I knew you were going to ask me this, and now I still don't answer.
So we covered cuckoldry, we covered concurrency and the Himba,
Jealousy.
we covered the sociology of science and human behavioral ecology and the manosphere. We covered a lot. Is there? I mean, we didn't get to one of the things that I had on my list. We didn't get to women's status. I know you have a
Yeah.
Mm.
paper on that. I'm very curious about that. It's actually a perfect example of the soundbiteification of our culture in that when men seek status, they often do it in a very violent and conspicuous way that is hard for us to ignore. And in fact, that is often by design. But yet, women's status seeking tends to be less conspicuous, but it is still there and it is still hugely important, and we need to understand it as social scientists. So I'm curious what your take is on women's status and what's
Yeah.
going on there.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we did have a paper on this and we found, I think actually what was interesting to me was some of the similarities between what was driving men's and women's status, at least among
Mhm.
Himba. So generosity, for example, was important for both. So we had
Okay.
found that previously that, as I talked about, sort of being generous is a good trait for a man to have and we found that for women too. More surprisingly to me that there wasn't kind of as clear, explicit an explanation for it. But I think it emphasizes to me the extrinsic parts of status are as important as like I think because we're focused on men's status, that we often think about this in terms of like internal qualities about masculinity and strength and things like that, right? And how good a hunter you are or whatever it is, right? But I think that the social aspects of how connected are you and in what ways and how do you treat other people, and so things like
Mm.
respectfulness and generosity and things like that um, pop out at me as some of the things that, and maybe those are things that, again, because they're a little bit more understated, maybe they're a bigger part of women's status than men's status. I don't know that we know the answer to that yet because we just don't have enough data on women's status. But I think that even for men, like those subtle things that are a little harder to pick up because you can't measure them in terms of grip strength or muscularity or something, I'd like to see more work on status, I guess, sort of start to look at that. And Chris does do some of that, but I think that if you look at like the larger body of work, you know, male attractiveness and male, the ability to get a woman, there's a much bigger chunk of the literature looking at physical strength and status coming out of sort of the legacy of sexual selection, right? But I mean, like we said, we're humans, we're complicated, we're cultural, we're navigating all of these norms. The ways in which we do that, I think, is probably much more integrated into status than we've uncovered so far.
Yeah. I mean, do you buy so there's this approach to, women versus men status seeking and social relationships that, throughout evolutionary history, men were more involved in coalitional competition and intergroup warfare. Therefore, their social strategy should be more geared towards forming, larger coalitions. So they should have a larger number of shallow male relationships. And if they have the fight, they should be able to, make amends more quickly, whereas women, it's a smaller number of more intense social relationships. There's more of a vibe of egalitarianism and mutual trust. Perhaps it's more geared toward cooperative breeding. So that's sort of a perspective I see in the literature approaching, women's versus men's sociality and status seeking. Do you buy that narrative? Do you think it's parts of it are right or parts of it are wrong? Where do you fit in with that picture?
I mean, I think I buy that the importance of status for men and women is going to reflect what their daily lives are like, right? And
Mhm.
the rules and norms that they have to abide by. So if you have, but so I think first of all, I guess there's this idea that somehow wider, broader networks are better than deeper smaller networks. And
Mhm.
right, like because I think we've attached this idea that like human sociality and the ability to, like, that's all because of men's, large networks or something, that we've decided that those are the traits that matter the most and not something about these kind of more subtle connections. I mean, women often are often the ones who are moving into a whole new household upon marriage, right? So patrilocal residence is more common than matrilocal residence. And so women are having to create and build a whole new network. Now, maybe that has a few deep connections, but that's still really important in terms of alliance building across groups and things like that. So that's one part. I think the other
Mhm.
part is that women's roles in men's networks are really understudied because they often, again, are more subtle, right? So if
Mhm.
men are making these decisions and the men are the ones who are sitting there having the formal discussions, making those decisions, it's often their wives who are they're having behind the scenes conversations with their wives, their sisters, their mothers, right, who are all, uh, equally involved in that process, but they may not be, their influence may not be as easily picked up, in that it may not be as
Right.
showy. And
Right.
I think that's another way that I think we need to think about the role of women's status. That is, it's harder to collect those data, but I think it's important, and we need to again think about new ways that we can try and actually explicitly go out and try and pick that stuff up, because I think
Right.
I do push back against this general assumption that it is men's ability to cooperate that has driven us as a species, as if women are in the, just because they may have been relegated to the back seat doesn't mean that they are actually in the back seat in terms of how a lot of these decisions are made.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I remember we sort of touched on this with our episode with Brenda Bowser on
Yes.
how women's social influence may be less conspicuous and visible by design.
Mhm.
And that if it is detected, then it often gets penalized. And so they have strategies where they can try to covertly influence affairs, which unfortunately makes our job as scientists much harder, because now we have to detect this thing that is intentionally being concealed for strategic reasons. But it make it way more interesting, I think. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about, the strategic nature of the ways in which influence might be concealed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if, like with Himba, for example, they're making these decisions. Like you can watch this summer when we were there, um, they were having a court case. And so the way that they do that is that everybody sort of gathers and they're talking this through, and then through sort of consensus, they're deciding on what the punishments should be. And it's like you can it's so obvious, right? Because the men are the inner circle, the main circle are all of these men, right? And then the women are sitting in groups on the outskirts of that main inner circle, right? And so you look at that and your first impression might be, well, it's the men who are making these decisions and the women are just sidelined where they're just sort of passively listening or something like that, right?
Mhm.
And yet, like, most Himba men will tell you that they've had conversations with their wives and their mothers and other women in their household. Well, they're all sitting around talking about this stuff and deconstructing it around the fire at night, and then the men go back the next day and they're in that same structure where they're talking. But to think that they're not being influenced by those fireside conversations, which are, mixed gender kinds of conversations,
Mhm.
or like then they go back to their huts and they're lying, maybe, even maybe if the women are more silent around the fire, but then they go back to their hut at night and just the husband and wife, and she may tell him what she really thinks. And,
Right.
so, I mean, yes, it is hard to pick up, but we know better now, right? Like, I think this
Yeah.
is, if you're going to move the science forward, like if you look at like the ethnographic atlas or something like that, right? Like a lot of what we take for these cross-cultural work, and this is not to throw shade on the ethnographic atlas, right? Like this was a huge accomplishment to create something like this where we can look at cross-cultural patterns. But most of those were collected by male anthropologists in the 19,
Mm.
50s, 60s, 40s,
Yeah.
whatever it was, right? And they're it's a first pass, right? They're picking up what they think is going on,
Yeah.
and I think that we now can take that information and know to dig a little bit deeper, like, and so there's sort of no excuse for not doing that, I guess, is
Yeah.
my feeling, right? Like we shouldn't just take for granted that the way that people sit in a circle tells you something about who has the most influence, right? It tells you something,
Yeah.
but it doesn't necessarily tell you everything.
Right. Making it what makes it even more challenging is that when the men come forward in the political sphere and propose an idea, they often have an incentive to conceal the fact that the idea came from their wife or their mother
Of course.
or their sister. Or
Yeah.
if they're pursuing some agenda, they might have an interest in concealing the fact that their wife was goading them to take this course of action. And so that makes it, we have concealing happening from both the women's end and the man's end, which makes it even harder to figure out what's really going on. Um, you know.
And if
Yeah.
there's
And
a norm of respectfulness, then
Yeah.
maybe that, like women understand that, like I think if women know they have that influence, then whether if they're following the norm of doing it behind the scenes, that's okay as long as they have that influence. And this is not to say that there aren't places where women have very little influence. Like that is
right.
also true, right? Like
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
downplay the idea that like,
Right.
male coercion is real.
Sure.
I think that we need to be able to disambiguate the cases where it's going on under the scenes versus the cases where they really are having their thoughts and
Yeah.
opinions curtailed.
Absolutely, but from an evolutionary perspective, even in cases where women are very clearly oppressed and coerced, you would still expect, from an adaptationist perspective, that they would effectively play the hand that they were dealt. Even if the hand they're dealt is shitty, they're still going to do whatever they can to, cause whatever influence they can cause to advance their interests. And so even there, I think we should be trying to delve as deep as we can to figure
Yeah,
that out.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I remember John and Brenda saying that it was only because they knew the community so well that they could even relay these anecdotes about this kind of cryptic leadership. And that really stuck with me. I was like, oh boy, we're the drunk looking for the keys in under the light. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, that's like status and leadership is, I feel like I've only really
Yeah.
barely scratched the surface on that as a topic. We did this one paper on it, but I think it takes years to kind of decide that this is your thing and dive into it. And it hasn't been my area of emphasis so far, but it's fun to sort of, pick a new topic and start to dig in on that too. So, but yeah, John and Brendan did a lot of that. So over many, many years. So I
Yeah.
trust
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
data for sure.
Yeah. Brooke, thank you so much. We'll have to have you on again because I know there's still so much more to cover. But that's a good thing because it means that there's just so much more to do. But thank you for coming on. Thank you for doing this work. I think every time we have an anthropologist on, we basically want to say thank you for your service because it's hot and dry and uncomfortable to go to the field. And as you said, it's sort of humbling and difficult. And we get to be in our like comfortable living rooms, or talk about it in comfortable chairs, on a podcast. In every sentence, there's like a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that goes into like the sentences you're saying. So we just want to thank you for doing that.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was fun.
Yeah. So, David, anything?
No, this was a blast. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Yep.
Well, here you are at the end of another episode of Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast. If you're still listening, that means you must be liking what you're hearing. And if you like what you hear, then what can people do, Dave?
They can support us by leaving a good review. Our reviews have sort of petered off. So, yeah, please, if you're listening, leave a review.
Yeah, absolutely. Things you like, things you don't like, ideas for future episodes, ideas for possible guests. We are open to hearing all of it. If you're so inclined, you can check out our Patreon page and support us there, or you can just say something nice about us on social media. Spread the word.
Yeah, and David still needs that fanny pack. So somebody get on
Yes.
that.
So if you have a fanny pack, please send it my way. You can reach out to me individually. I won't give my contact information right here, but you know where to find me.
You can email
Yeah,
you can email
email
the
the
pod.
podcast.
Yeah,
And, yeah.
excellent. And we'll make
Please
sure
send a picture of the
we'll
fanny
make
pack
sure,
just so
we'll make sure we'll
with,
make sure
with the
David
dimensions
gets,
included.
we'll make sure David gets it. It's very the dimensions are very important. But thank you very much for listening. And yeah, we're just having wonderful guests. I'm very happy with our guests.
Yeah, our guests are fantastic.
We can send them fanny packs.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. See you next week.